Good evening, everyone. As Erin said, my name is Stacy Russell, and I'm the interim director of the Muskingum County Library System. I'd like to thank you all for attending our third annual Community Read event in partnership with Zane State and Ohio University Zanesville. The purpose of Community Read, which was originated as On the Same Page Muskingum, some of you may remember that, years ago, is to foster a community-wide conversation about relevant topics that affect our community. Our Community Read planners seek to find books that appeal to our diverse community, are timely, and can strike great conversations. Over the past month, the library has hosted multiple events to support our Community Read this year, from book discussions to voter registrations to escape rooms. We have loved seeing the community involved and interested in participating in all of these events, even during these challenging times. Tonight, we are so excited to have with us Alexis Coe, the author of You Never Forget Your First. She is a historian and New York Times best-selling author, as well as consulting producer on the History Channel series Washington. Ms. Coe has participated in CNN, the History Channel, C-SPAN, and CBS. She's lectured at Columbia, West Point, Georgetown, Sarah Lawrence, NYU, the New School, and the University of San Francisco, and many, many others. Wow, it just makes me tired, Alexis, just seeing all the things that you've been doing. She has contributed to the New Yorker, the New York Times opinion section, the New York Times Magazine, New Republic, the Paris Review, Elle, and many other publications. After graduate school, Ms. Coe was a research curator in the exhibitions department at the New York Public Library in Bryant Park. We are thrilled to have You Never Forget Your First this year. This book is particularly relevant given the current presidential election and all of the race conversations going on around the country. I know I have really enjoyed this book and learned a lot. It's a very lively take on George Washington, and Alexis certainly peeled away some of the myths around our current first president. And I'm really looking forward to a great evening full of fun and lively conversation with you all. Please join me in welcoming Alexis Coe.
It's hard when you're talking to a group and you can't see them, but I'm still so glad that we're doing this. I like to say that the past, it doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And I think that what was really interesting to me over the course of writing this book and then being on book tour was how it changed, how everything sort of different parts became really relevant to me. And one of the parts that I always loved from the very beginning was Washington's way of finding a council. So when he was the general, he had people like Hamilton, not only as an aide de camp, but as someone who would go and consult with. He would, get everyone's opinion, and then he would make a decision. He really valued other people's opinions. He knew they came from different places, that they had different experiences than him. He felt really deficient in his education because he was the eldest son of the second marriage, which means he didn't inherit anything. His mother was single in order not to deprive her children of anything else. And it was rough. At times, he didn't have enough corn to feed his horses. And of course, that meant that the enslaved community was faring far worse on the property. But fast forward, he's president, and the Constitution says, you will not have a Privy Council. And that's because there was still this belief among the founders that what had happened for a long time was King George was just being unduly influenced by, all these rich guys who were invested in land and other, ventures in America. And they also wanted everything to be public. That's a part of a democracy, which is what America is. It's a republic, it's a democracy. And so they said, what you can do is you can go and you have two choices. The first choice is you can go to Congress and you can ask their opinion. And so Washington says, great, that's a whole bunch of people in a room and we can get something worked out. So immediately he's faced with this issue. As soon as he gets there, there's an issue with the Creeks and with settlements. So the Creeks are Indians, and he needs to come up with a solution. And he needs to tell the people who are going to negotiate with the Creeks what to say. So he goes to council and Adams is the president of Congress. That's the role of the vice president. So he's, he introduces him in this really awkward way, and then he sits down, and Washington gets up, and he's already sent homework ahead of time, which was his move always. He sent questions ahead of time. He sent them all the information that he had, like 2 weeks before. So he expected when he got there that they would launch into it. So it's his turn to speak. He turns to Congress and he asks for their opinions, and they're just overwhelmed. The journals from this time, the diaries, some of them are just like, it's so amazing to see him in person. He's everything that I had heard he was. He's just wonderful. And then others are like, I'm not comfortable. I don't want to say how I feel. Washington, in a very rare moment, he used to do this all the time when he was a young man, but not, as time went on, he really worked hard to control himself. He lost his temper. He absolutely lost his temper. So the first time the president of the United States goes to Congress, he loses it. And he says, why did I even come here? This is worthless. So then he does option B, second option from the Constitution. And he, by the way, annotated the Constitution. He got a copy. He had been at the Constitutional Convention, but when he got the final copy, he annotated and he wrote president, maybe president. So he really was, he knew his stuff. So he decides, okay, I'll write to the heads of each department who are like Hamilton and other Jefferson, people I appointed, I trust them. But the problem was mail was slow, and, they would respond, and then he'd have follow-up questions and he'd send it back. And it was ridiculous. So finally, when the president's capital moved from New York to Philadelphia, he said, okay, I'm going to invite everyone over. And that's how the presidential cabinet was born. And he thought, I don't want people who all agree with each other. I want people who have different philosophies. I want the smartest people with different philosophies. And so he invites people, among them Randolph, Hamilton, and Jefferson. And Jefferson and Hamilton, as we know famously from Hamilton the musical, managed to negotiate a central bank in exchange for the capital being in D.C., Washington, D.C., close to Virginia, where a lot of these guys, including Washington, were from. But it's one thing to fight a war. It's one thing to come up with a constitution, to sort of set up a government. It's another to really run it together. So that was lost on Washington, and he would write all of them letters, but particularly Hamilton and Jefferson, and he would say, you guys have to get along. You're being too sensitive. Jefferson would later describe these cabinet meetings as cockfights. Cockfights, which are illegal in many places, because you have them fight to the death. And in this situation, Washington, of course, is the person who is in charge of this fight and retreat. So Washington, intending to bypass partisanship by having everyone together in a room, accidentally creates it. And both Hamilton and Jefferson secretly start these partisan newspapers. Newspapers, by the way, were partisan from the beginning in America. And they write all these anonymous essays under pseudonyms like Porcupine. And that's my favorite because it's really accurate, right? The stuff that he wrote, it pricked everywhere with every sentence. And by the end of his term, he wasn't even speaking to a lot of them. And so I have this section in the book in which I like to sort of at the beginning of each chapter and the beginning of each section give you sort of things that you should know or interesting tidbits that I don't want lost in the text, because I have other things I want to discuss in the text. And I also want you to feel like you are the expert. You know as much as I know, and we're going through it together. And so, for example, my favorite is, I'll read you my favorite. I have a bunch here, but Thomas Paine. So Thomas Paine, before Washington became president, said, "I shall never suffer a hint of dishonor or even deficiency of respect to you to pass unnoticed." So he's saying, like, I will duel with anyone who ever says anything about you. And then after Washington became president, his colloquial talents were not above mediocrity, possessing neither copious ideas nor fluency of words. In public, when called on for a sudden opinion, he was unready, short, and embarrassed. I'm sorry, that was Jefferson. Paine wrote, I was like, oh, that's too articulate. Paine wrote, you, sir, are treacherous in private friendship, a hypocrite in public life. The world will be puzzled to decide whether you're an apostate or an impostor, whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any. It's quite insulting. So by the end, Washington was only talking to one person, literally one person, not talking to Jefferson, not talking to Paine, not talking to any of the Jameses, James Madison, James Monroe, only talking to John Adams. And John Adams, he didn't really include in the government. He would write to him once in a while, but he didn't have him in the cabinet, didn't have him that involved because Adams sort of messed it up from the beginning and messed it up for every vice president, kind of until Cheney and then Biden, who were, more involved. But he started out before Washington got there because it took a lot longer to get to New York, the first capital, from Virginia than it did to get there from, Boston, where Adams was from, on horseback. And so Adams gets there first and he's like, we need to figure out what to call Washington. And Washington is not about titles. He wouldn't be king. Remember, he gave up power at the end of the war. He's the president. He's not a king. He's not a dictator. Adams goes on with like a 15-word title, His Majesty, His Empress, the Holiness of the President. And Washington is just humiliated. And he realizes that every time he speaks, people are going to think that he's speaking on behalf of Washington. And so he has to make it very clear that is not the case. So as I said, by the time he leaves office, he's estranged from a lot of these people who will be president. He is leaving the country divided. And his farewell address, he goes through a couple different versions. And what's really interesting is Hamilton is the one who says, you need to tone it down. This isn't going to age well. Hamilton, as we know, famously outed himself in the Reynolds pamphlet for having an affair, detailed it, gave us far more than we needed to know. And he's telling Washington, this isn't a good look. And the thing that really resonated with me in the last few years, and it took, I started writing this in 2014, it came out in February, was his farewell address, and particularly this part. Washington praised the infant country's rapid progress, which would continue if it focused on ambitions, not alliances. The policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and the will of another. Foreign influence, he was saying, is the enemy of American unity, so unity despite your party, and prosperity, because it, quote, whipped up jealousy, ill will, and disposition to retaliate. It's hard not to look at what's happening today and some of the hearings and not see that. And he worried, and this is a quote, that cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men, he was really, really wary of unprincipled men. He felt that he was very principled, and he liked to surround himself with people who were principled in the right ways to him. So obviously Hamilton was unprincipled in some ways. But when it came to honesty and when it came to service to his country, he wasn't. That he felt that they would be enabled, these men who were just ambitious, who just wanted power, enabled to subvert the will of the people and usurp for themselves the government. So political partisanship, he thought the problem with it is it reduces the government to bickering. They're not actually doing things. They're not making policy. They're not passing laws. They're not talking to people. They're not going around and seeing what's really going on outside of New York, Philadelphia, DC. And if all the representatives were just bickering and thwarting each other left and right and just trying to stop the other person, so they didn't actually even have policies of their own, it was just to stop the other party, that they would fail the American people. They would not do well by their constituents. But again, with Washington, for all this talk of unity, he came to see people as either for or against him. That either you agreed with him or you didn't, but you didn't necessarily criticize him in public, and he never responded to public criticism, but he was very hurt by it. And then unbridled partisanship, his greatest fear was his greatest failure. And that is something that we still live with. But when people say partisanship has never been this bad, it's always been this bad. It's always been this bad. And it's important to remember that. And the second thing I really want to talk about, and then I can take a step back. And if you have any questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat and they'll funnel them to me. And I'm happy to, answer them as we go along or at the end. Washington, his body was amazing. I talk a little bit about how in my introduction and the preface about how some of the male biographers are sort of, obsessed with his masculinity. And I'm not as obsessed with that, but his body was amazing to the point where I started making this list when I was researching, and this is what sort of inspired all the rest of the list of all the diseases he had had. And so diseases survived, and it just goes on and on and on. And for a lot of these things, the treatment is prayer. The treatment is things that do not help you, that actually hurt you, like bloodletting, Peruvian bark, cold compresses, laudanum, that was quite nice. That was opium. Ointment, rest, fresh air, bloodletting, vomiting, draining. And he had these throughout his entire life. And in fact, if he hadn't have had a very bad case of camp fever, as they called it, he would not have left the British militia, which he was a part of when he was younger. He fought for the British in order to go see a doctor, and heard that there was a really young, rich widow holding a dinner party that he should probably try and get an invitation to. And that's how he met Martha Washington, his retirement plan, and helped him realize sort of everything. And John Adams actually said that he thought that Washington would not have been anyone without Martha. And it's a really interesting comment. And I think he means it in a really holistic way, like not only her support and her input, but her money and her land and slaves and children. She came with the whole package. Now, Washington not only personally experienced a lot of illness, but there were two pivotal points during his public career as an American that were significant, in which he made good decisions. He didn't always make good decisions, but here he really did. And he responded to something based on experience and expertise and practice. So when the British came, they brought diseases, of course, just like when the Americans came, they brought diseases, or when rather the British and the French came to the Americas. So Washington had had smallpox. When he was 19, the one time he ever traveled out of the country, he went to Barbados with his half-brother, who would die thereafter, and in fact, another person who often benefited from death. And he went and he contracted smallpox. And he knew that if you had had it, that you could be immune to it. And so when the British were trying to purposely infect Americans in order to weaken them, he decided that, and this was really risky because we were, we didn't have a boat. They had the world's most powerful navy. He made sure that everyone was inoculated. And not only that, he made Martha get an inoculation. She was deathly afraid of it. And so that was really important. And in fact, it's historians agree that we made it through the first year of the revolution because of the smallpox inoculation. It really cannot be understated. And a bunch of other trickery and funny things, like building up this thing called a chandelier in order to make it look like we had a lot of more weapons than we did, because we didn't. The second time there was an outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia, the capital. The mayor died. Tons of people died, and he evacuated the city and evacuated himself and other people, and they corresponded and they responded to the moment. And it wasn't efficient, it wasn't expedient. They would sometimes meet up in other towns and cities, but they didn't go back to Philadelphia until Washington had heard from a good amount of experts that it was safe. And then sort of step back and talk about Washington why do we need another Washington biography? Why should we study Washington? Let's talk about that. There is seemingly this spectrum, right, of extremes in which people either want to celebrate a founder or someone in our history who has been significant, and just say, yes, they weren't perfect, but that doesn't matter. Like, we should just prioritize what they did. And this exists in like every realm in literature. Do you, Lolita, do you still read it, even though you know what happened? Then on the other side is allegedly what we understand from the headlines, cancel culture, who says these people were bad and we shouldn't see them anywhere. And we should just sort of like try to rebuild by starting a new national story. I don't actually think there are that many people at that extreme. And I like maybe, a few. And we know that there's some people at that extreme, but I think most people are actually in the middle. And I always, when I discuss it with people, when I discuss Washington, and let's say the only times I ever hear cancel culture is when I am somewhere in which they're, college aged or something, and they're overwhelmed by what they're learning. And a part of that is our fault because it takes so long to teach them that. But what I try to say is, okay, the founders are not the same as the Confederates, and it's really important not to conflate them, and that's been happening a lot. You could remove Washington's name from the Capitol, and you could take down a statue, a monument in Oregon. And I wrote a lengthier explanation than this in the Washington Post fairly recently. And you can do the same to Robert E. Lee or other people. And the thing is, Washington, you will still have to have his presence everywhere, because when you take away a war from not Lee in particular, but the majority of Confederate generals, there's not going to be a lot left to talk about as far as contributions to society. And in fact, treason is not often considered a contribution. Washington, yes, he enslaved people. He, approved and in fact ordered and oversaw and sometimes took part in genocide of Indians. He did a lot of bad things, but he also did a lot of good things. And that doesn't matter because we can't separate him from our country. He is a part of our founding story. And what we should do instead of living at these extremes is simply hold those two things at once. And this is something that is fairly unique to America, because as we know from Netflix and from Amazon Prime, there are endless programs on all the terrible things the royal family has done, all the scandals. And you have that in every single country, right? You have that with the Russian Empire and, the British Empire, the French, the Revolution. Everyone understands that their country has a messy history that isn't everything that they wanted it to be, but they have been around for a lot longer than us. And so the incremental improvement, it's a lot better. I think that as we settle into a less tumultuous time, and certainly when we're not all isolated and at home and frightened of a lot of things and very stressed out for all sorts of reasons, we will be able to have better conversations about this. But I really, what's really important about the founders in general is that we see them with clear eyes, and we understand that there's a real difference between someone who's historically significant, this guy, and someone who's your role model, which can also be this guy. But one doesn't necessarily lead to the other, and it doesn't have to. We do have to study him. And, I've spent years with him. I slept at Mount Vernon, which was a lovely thing and quite an honor. And I have a lot of mixed feelings about him, but I don't look away. And that's, I think, the most important thing in general with history and with life. I mean, in order to understand something, we have to really try and fully see it. I would love to, as I said, I'm on my phone, so you'll see my finger, which I apologize for. And it's really nice to see those of you who have, and I understand that, everyone's doing things and such, but it's really nice to see those of you who I can see on the camera. So thank you for that. And okay, do you think that history is being made a high enough priority in education? Absolutely not. First of all, our poor teachers who are, if you've had any glitches with me during this conversation, I saw a friend of mine who teaches was locked out of her classroom in the middle of it. She teaches second grade. Can you imagine? I have a baby who you might be able to hear in the background. She had COVID. We're all dealing with things, but anyway, so education was the question. And I think, no, we are absolutely failing to educate our children on American history in a meaningful way, in ways that I think really teaches them to be invested in it and invested in civics and in our democracy. And I think that there is obviously, we have these moments, and we have always throughout history. This is not, specific to our time, as many of you know, because you've lived through it. Whenever there is social upheaval because events have come to a head, whether it is the civil rights movement, whether it is the Great Depression, as exhausting as life is right now, it is really great to see so many people who really want to know about George Washington. And those people, by the way, are every single age group. It was really wonderful to, when we still traveled physically, in February, right before everything, I was at Mount Vernon and I spoke to a crowd of, a few hundred people. And then as I made my way through the United States to California, where I'm originally from, I met their children, I met their nieces and their nephews, and they were all reading the book. And they were talking about it. And it's sort of funny to think, like, at the time they were like, I don't know how we're going to do it, like a Google Hangout, or we might do this thing called Zoom. And of course, now that is the regular. But to use something like this to talk about America and to talk about issues, I think is really nice. And I think we are depriving our children of the ability to do that, and depriving ourselves of having these conversations in ways that can be really meaningful. We could do better in civics. We could provide free civics classes. It wouldn't be that difficult to have like a Saturday or a Sunday class. In other countries like Canada, for example, they have 2-minute like history moments about Canadian history. And they're not always, celebratory, but they're really informative. And so all my Canadian friends are constantly telling me things or making connections, excited. And you can't do that if the people don't know. And these are not historians. They're writers of other things. They write memoirs. One woman writes about, beauty. But because she had this early education, when she hears me say something or read something, she asks me a really smart question. I think that's the other thing, is we do tend to make people feel stupid if they don't know something. And I think of everyone as being as smart as the next person, certainly as smart as me, but not necessarily knowing everything that I know. And I think that's a really important thing too, is to make sure that that we make people feel okay about their curiosity, and if it maybe is it politically, if they're asking about slavery in a state that had slaves, that is sensitive, and they have to sort of feel able to do so. At the same time, historians need to make history fun a little bit more. And even someone like Washington, as I hope that I've proven, can be fun, even the difficult stuff. We can add levity to any situation. Anyone who's ever mourned someone or been through a difficult time knows that you have to sometimes just have a laugh, and that's okay. It's okay to talk about these things and how ridiculous they are. We don't have to. It's just make it your own. Make history your own and explore it however you want. And until education sort of supplies it for you, that's what's going on. But you're already doing that because you're here and you attend a library. And libraries are my favorite places in the world, as I was telling them before we got on. They're wonderful places to just be. I grew up going to libraries after school and sneaking into the adult section and reading things like Contract with America. So it got very confusing for a while. But I think that libraries, the kind of programming that they have and the sort of classes that they offer supplement so much of what is not happening in our schools. And it's a free place to not only learn things, but be a part of a community and have these people who, librarians, all they want to do is help. You will never feel, I can't think of one time a librarian has ever made me feel bad. Never once. And I'm very sensitive, I assure you. Okay, I'm going to head to some more questions. We tend to think of the founders being from the upper classes, but don't always know the origins of that wealth. So I was very surprised to read that his grandmother was an indentured servant. Did any of the other founders come from that background? Yes, to me that was amazing. And I was upset that we didn't know that, because what a great American story, right? And that was this weird thing, is other biographers had worked so hard to make it seem like his father, who died when he was 10, was this, you know, important role model, and this half brother who he saw once in a while was very clearly like that rich relative who you need to just go and like be polite to and work for connections, and that's very clearly what was going on. But his mother raised him, and it's an amazing American story. So his grandmother is an indentured servant, comes over to a colony, and her grandson ends up rebelling and making it a democracy for one type of person. It is an amazing story. Is it the perfect story? No, wouldn't have been great if he said, it's a democracy for everyone. Didn't happen. He said, you know, he sort of hated on ambition in his farewell address, but every single president is ambitious. I'm ambitious. People have to be ambitious to accomplish things, and that's an okay thing. By the way, the person who first told me that was Doris Kearns Goodwin, who I worked on the History Channel series with. And she interrupted someone else in the writer's room, and she just sort of said it just like that. Every president has been ambitious. Ambitious is an essential quality. And I think that's good. But then what about, you know, what we need to sort of work on that ambition and what it means, and what it means in service and government. But as far as founders, you know, Adams did not come from great wealth. He wasn't poor, but he was a teacher before. He had, you know, a very modest estate. Abigail Adams kept quite a tidy house. And I mean that she was renting and selling and making moves. And, oh, she did things that he actually had to tell her to stop, because if it had been sort of talked about, it wouldn't have been a good look. Abigail Adams is one of these women who, had she lived in any other era, I mean, had she lived now, she probably would be president, and John Adams would be holding her purse. There's, you know, or they might be, I don't know, they might be some sort of president, vice president, you know, couple. Who knows? The possibilities are endless with the Adams. But in these letters, because they have so many, they were apart, thank goodness, for so long. So we have so many. Everyone who is together, it's bad news for historians. Everyone always tells their wives the best stuff. So she is raising young kids. John Adams is negotiating, you know, trying to get loans for us to fight this war abroad. And inflation is rampant, of course, because most of the goods were coming from London. And so she starts to like get John, she starts asking him to send her large amounts of things like pins and other things that she knows that ladies who do have some money are starting to pay a lot of money for, and also trying to hoard. And he sends them not really understanding, you know, they have daughters, she has sisters, you know, whatever. And then he realizes she's selling them. She's selling them at like a huge markup. And she does this again, by the way. This is actually pretty bad. At the end of the revolution, when people were buying soldiers, basically like their promissory notes that they would get paid for their service. There was almost this big uprising. And they, so she buys them and then, you know, sells them to other people. And it's basically like you're selling a bond. And again, Adams was like, this is a bad look. So there's definitely like deprivation. And then they just all overspent to an incredible degree. Washington died in debt, not because he had to, but because all of the Virginians were land rich and cash poor, which means that if they had sold the land, they would have more cash. And also, if they owned hundreds of people, they could have, So Washington said, basically, oh, I can't afford to emancipate my slaves. He didn't pay all his creditors. And then when he died, his will was published, which had a lot of surprises. One of them was how much land he had. He had so much. He was one of the richest men in America, and he had to take out a loan to get to both of his inaugurations. But he wore diamond buttons. So I just they overspent. Jefferson bought his library and then had to sell it to the Library of Congress, which is good because it created the Library of Congress. And then he was so miserable without it that he then bought it again. And so he died $100,000 in debt, which is a tremendous amount because remember, this is, the 1800s. And then Hamilton obviously didn't come from any wealth. Both his parents, his dad, we don't know. His mom had died when he was young. He had no money. His, town sponsored his voyage to America. He had scholarships. He married rich, though, which is really good because Eliza lived for 50 more years, as we know, again, from Hamilton, which has its own issues, by the way, as many things do. And so there was a bit of inconsistency, but definitely a lot of them died in debt and did not need to at all. Okay. How I got started with writing of historical books is okay, two at once. Historical books for children. The New York Historical Society has this junior historians program that I spoke at, and I was so impressed with these kids. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to go and see their finalists and their short list for their New York Historical Society, junior reads, and just everything on there are good. Those are excellent recs. I'm sure your librarians can also tell you. Never Caught by Erica Dunbar, which is about a woman who Washington enslaved who escaped, and he then hunted for almost the rest of his life. That they have a young reader's version, and I think that's really powerful, and you can co-read, right? You could read with the young reader, which I'm very excited to do with my daughter. When right now she is up, down, mama, her friend Alma, that's it. But one day co-reading. No, after grad school I worked at the New York Public Library, and I thought I would always work in public history. And then my grandparents, this is going to get personal, my grandparents who raised me both got sick, and they both had cancer, and I was their health agent. I was the person who was in charge of their, final months, and it happened within 6 months. And so I took a leave of absence, but then of course the overall sickness was a year, and I had to just leave the New York Public Library, which is unfortunate. But I started because I'm from California and that's where they lived. And I still, went to museums, and I found myself at an exhibition. I noticed that there was a press preview, and I knew from, being a part of my own press previews for exhibitions where you invite the media to see it before it opens in hopes that they'll write about it and then get people to come. I snuck into the press preview as if I belonged. And I was standing in front of something, and a guy next to me was furiously taking notes, and I chuckled at something that was written, and he asked what was funny, and I explained that it was just completely wrong. And then he introduced himself as the editor of a paper who was covering for his museum critic who had gone into labor early. And he asked, we chatted for a couple of minutes, then he said, you write it. And I did not think I could. I had written exhibition catalogs and panel texts and all sorts of things. And my boss had actually told me, you should try and write history books on the side. And I just never thought that I would. But I had all this time, so I thought, okay, what could go wrong here? famous last words. And it all happened very quickly because I did have expertise in it. So I wrote one review, and then I ended up taking over this woman's maternity leave and then writing for a bunch of places. And about 3 months in, a local writer lived locally who's a senior editor, I think, still at The Atlantic, Alexis Madrigal, saw my work, liked it, and I was in The Atlantic shortly thereafter. And things happened very quickly. But remember, I already had a graduate degree, and I had been working at the NYPL and also before that, the Brooklyn Historical Society. And now, I mean, I'm just, life has sort of happened in this way where I work on these projects for years at a time. And I don't actually consider myself a writer. I mean, I'm a historian. I don't even know if, when I think of writers, I'm friends with writers, and they study writing, and they'll quote poetry and such. And I don't think of myself, I'll quote Roosevelt. I don't think of myself as that. But I also work in all these different mediums, which is really exciting for me, because I think history, in order to be a better part of our culture, needs to be a bigger part of education and needs to exist in a lot of different ways. And so, working on the TV series, appearing in a lot of documentaries, I've hosted podcasts. I'm constantly on podcasts almost every weekend. I'm on MSNBC. And so I work in all these different mediums. And so I definitely consider myself first and foremost a historian. And also, writing is awful. It's very hard. It's incredibly lonely, but it's really nice too. And there are parts of it that I'm really proud of. But yeah, I don't necessarily think of myself as a writer. And I think if that's all I did, I would sort of go insane. Okay. No, I haven't written. This is my first child, and she's 18 months. So right now we're like brown bearing it. And we haven't really gotten to anything historical yet. But when I was on book tour, I picked up a book at every single bookstore or a location like Mount Vernon. They gave me this great book about John Adams and an alligator. And they didn't give it to me, I bought it. But support your local institutions. But I picked up books at every single place, and I'm hoping that we get to read them together, and that I do get better situated in it, because I would love to. And as I said, I love doing these events and I love talking to people, but I'm always floored at how much I enjoy talking to middle schoolers or elementary school kids whenever friends invite me to talk to their classes, or their children, or nieces or nephews invite me to their classes. It's really fun. And also they're such good critical thinkers. They really just instinctually know what's what. They cut through it and they just figure out what the motivations are, and it's refreshing. Presented both Martha and Mary Washington so differently than Flexner. Yes. Particularly Mary. Whew. Okay. So I am the first woman historian in 100 years to write a book about Washington. And I'm the third woman in total. The people who came before me more than 40 years ago, a journalist, a conservative journalist, and a novelist who mostly dealt in fantasy fiction. And I don't say that to discredit anyone or to amplify myself. It's simply a staggering number that doesn't really exist anywhere else. It's not great. It's not great with other presidents, particularly around the founders. And everyone I've mentioned, by the way, is white. But it's significant because then everyone has a very similar experience, particularly because a lot of the people who write about this are from the East Coast, or they're from Virginia in particular, Maryland. They have connections. They visited these places as young men. When they write about certain things, they're very interested and very curious and thorough, and nothing gets past them. And that those categories are, for example, the military, battles, things to do with the Constitution. I've found nothing really off in a lot of them. When it comes to the women, this exists, by the way, though, in a lot of different places, where you'll look at people's who they're citing, and they just keep citing someone else instead of a primary source, and then you get back to the original person and realize there is no primary source. It's just been gossip and rumor for like 200, 300 years. this happens with everyone. This happens with Lincoln. That's why we call her Mary Todd Lincoln. She never used Todd after the day she got married. She never used it again. And it's someone who like really hated her and knew it bugged her. And so he used it, Lincoln's law partner, Herndon. And he also said that this woman he had been briefly engaged to was the woman that Lincoln actually really loved. And so Mary, who lived for another decade, didn't even get to sort of have this moment that like Jackie Kennedy and other people were, they were at least respected as the widower. It was really bad. Anyway, so one of the things, so the way that they talked about women struck me as off. The same way they talked about his body being really masculine, like talking about his thighs, and it seemed honestly like romance novels. Really, really did. And I don't mean that in a denigrating way. I mean that in that it's just not something that I ever see in presidential history. There's great man history, but this was like talking about like rippling muscles through his jaw and, you know, things you couldn't know and nobody commented on in letters. So why are we going there? And then Martha, the first thing I noticed was, you know, they all make Martha out to seem really great. And I always tell people, don't be fooled by the bonnet. Don't be fooled by the bonnet. She, her letters, it's quite clear that, you know, she was very caring and loving to her family and to her friends. She said that Black people were inherently bad. She said lots of other things and did lots of other things that were unkind. And so it was weird. But then the way that they talked about Mary, Washington's mother, who again, amazing story, she persevered as a single mother. She sacrificed so much. And you can see the hardship in the ledgers. You see that they had no income. You see that she went to court twice when women weren't allowed to go to court. So she had to hire someone to represent her and fight for fair prices on tobacco because her family was starving. And so I noticed that they said things about her that were odd, like she was crusty. I've never heard anyone describe someone in history as crusty. If you're not, you didn't know them. It's a weird thing. And then much was made of when the book first came out, particularly of Ron Chernow. And I say in the book, I really like Ron Chernow. I think he's a great writer. And he doesn't, you know, they didn't read a single book on motherhood during this time. They just weren't interested in that sort of thing. So they didn't know the norms and they really harshly judged her, including Flexner. And one of the things that Chernow said, and they're all quoting each other, so I'm sort of including Flexner and all these other guys in it, is that Mary was illiterate. So as a historian, the first thing that struck me as odd is I had seen letters to and from her that she had written, and we can see them. They're in her hand. The hand is consistent. The way that she talks is consistent. It's not being transcribed through someone else. And also Washington had some of her books, some of her Bibles. All of her books were religious. Martha, on the other hand, read novels because she was a well-to-do woman and that's what she could do. So there was this like, illiterate didn't mean that she couldn't read and they didn't really care. They didn't quote her. They didn't care about her voice, but it's that it was a class thing and it was just another way to judge her for not being refined in the way that Martha was. And what was funny is there was this like desire to elevate Washington to what he wanted, to give him what he wanted. The way that people always say, like, he was destined to be president. Nobody's destined to be president. If that was true, I don't think anyone would have said that about Barack Obama when he was a boy. I don't think that people would have said that about Lincoln when he was a boy. He grew up really poor. He didn't go to school for years. You know, he had so many failed attempts in his youth at trying to get elected, and was pretty unpopular in a lot of different ways. So I think what's really important here is that when we study history, we take our responsibility to be as objective as possible, because we all have an agenda, really seriously, and to be curious about other people. And I know that for a long time, we know that how racism and how other things sort of dissipate is interaction, right? And I know that a lot of these people moved in spaces that were entirely white and entirely male for a long time, and still almost are, because I've been to their conferences and their symposiums, and I've been the only woman on the panel or in the room. And there was one Black person at one symposium I went to at Mount Vernon out of a dozen. So I think that when you move in those spaces, what happens is you don't get other perspectives and you don't think about other perspectives. And so to them, it was sort of like, okay, I have to talk about slavery. I'm going to amplify Billy Lee, and I'm even going to call him Billy Lee, even though he went by William Lee, and that's the name that he was legally known as. And they just sort of like would take these things and run with them without checking them. And so my work was to ignore a lot of the battles, particularly because he wasn't at a lot of them, and he certainly wasn't in the throes of things, and instead look at what they had ignored. And they started out all their books saying, he's too Marvel to be real, we can't get close to him. And I did too. We all endeavor to do that. But I just really strongly felt that if I wanted to have an authentic stab at it, that I really needed to do that. And I needed to try and know what I don't know, which is really difficult, and constantly ask questions and be curious about things. And it's interesting to think that this can still happen with Washington. It can still happen with Kennedy. I was talking to an archivist at the Kennedy Library last week, and she was talking about how Rose Kennedy's diaries have been really useful to people and have been thoroughly mined by all historians. And they have been mined for things about Jack, for things about Ted Kennedy, the famous Kennedys, all these things. And I said, people map things, how many rooms are in this, like historians and archivists, they do a lot of work for you in this setting with presidents, never really with anyone else. It's very difficult to study a president because there's so much. It's also, you get a huge leg up. One of the things though that I asked was, is there a list of all the people who worked in the House? And they didn't have one. And to me, that's crazy, because those people, there's oral histories that exist. Surely they all had conversations with their families. Maybe there's like a trunk in an attic and we're going to find some new letters. Like maybe there's something. And if you're not curious and you don't just ask a lot of questions, you're not going to find things. And so that's basically what I try to do, is I go into it as blind as I can make myself, because we all have agendas and we all have proclivities, and then come out the other end. And I was, to be totally honest, I was very, very nervous about how different it was. And even though like Doris blurbed it, so I knew that at least it was on her level, and I talked to her about it for years. And a woman named Martha Saxton, the only woman nominated this year for the George Washington Prize, was writing a book on Mary Washington, but I didn't get to read it because I had to turn in my book before hers went to press. And so all we had were emails and phone calls, but those like 3 were amazing. And I also ran things by Mary Thompson, a legendary historian at Mount Vernon. And most importantly, I picked the most unlikely of fact checkers. Man at the Washington Library. There are a lot of people who I could have gone with, and who people have asked me why I didn't, who are in this world. I went with Bill Ferraro at the Washington Papers, the senior most series editor, not because I felt like we had the best rapport or he agreed with me, but because he understood what I was trying to do, and then told me if I should pursue in one area, like, oh yeah, you're onto something, like marrying a literate. He told me, you're right. Or I don't see this happening, and I don't think that this is a risky thing. So either you need to substantiate it, or we need to, and I loved him in that way. And so much so that and he was, by the way, I made that seem a lot nicer than he really is. I had him come onto the Washington series project for the History Channel, and he was bad cop. I would call him in when I needed a bad cop, and he would be that bad cop. And whenever I tell people in the Washington world that, like, I love Bill Ferraro, he's so sweet, and he's so kind and funny, and he just likes things to be right. And I don't see any problem in that because he's fair. His wife sewed our first masks in March when it had all just happened. They were on my daughter's first birthday Zoom. As I said, these relationships, or I was talking to the librarians before we went live, that I formed these relationships with people, with archivists throughout the country of all ages, of all backgrounds, and they're stuck with me for such a long time, and they make me the historian who I am. And which is, thank your historian, thank your archivist, support them. That was a long answer. Are there more stories, times surveying the terror? Oh, so many. Do I find it intimidating? I'm going to with the Ohio, I go into that a little bit. There's a great book, Peter Stark, who I put in the Washington series, wrote this book called Young Washington. And it's a long book in which he goes into the Ohio. So he's exciting too. He's like, everything's an adventure story. So I would definitely look into that. So I will just direct you that. I want to say this. Do you feel intimidated being the only woman? I feel scared at some points, because I know there have been scary moments at certain points, because I know that people will fundamentally disagree with me, not because of what I say or what I do, but because of who I am. And I also come, I've had a really lovely career, and Washington is a cottage industry for some people. This is all they do. And they only speak at small historical societies, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they're not thrilled about someone coming in and having a Washington book that got a lot of attention at the beginning of the year, and it was a bestseller, and a lot of them are publishing in academic presses. And so there was a group of 2 or 3 who would ask me for favors, and then also write very snarky blog posts. And so that to me is not, it's uncomfortable, and it feels unfair, and especially because I like some of their work, and it makes me feel like I should question some of it because they have biases. But as far as researching, and if other times being the only woman in the room, I don't mind. This has been going on for a long time. I didn't meet Doris until about 2017 or 2018, but remember, she's been the only woman in the room for a long time. When Obama summoned historians for that secret dinner or whatever it was, she was the only woman. And if someone hands me a drink or asks me whose research assistant I am or whatever, it's okay. It doesn't really matter. I also, though, have never here. They're usually really nice. And my undergraduate advisor was a man, and treated me like a graduate student, and very much made me into one. And I feel as if I've had great male and female mentors, and that part I don't mind. It's really just when it's unfair, when I'm not being judged on the quality of my work or my person, and rather on my gender. And that's something that we've all experienced at one point or another. But I always tell young women that you might not always feel welcome, but the more unwelcome you feel, the more you're needed. And so it's just sort of what we have to do. And all those women we celebrate, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Rosa Parks, they didn't work alone, but they were in very difficult and scary situations, different extents. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was fired when she got pregnant. There are all these things that women have faced who we admire. And so what I'm experiencing in the long run, or have experienced, is a drop in the bucket, and also makes it so much easier for other people. And I owe them that, because lots of women like Doris have made it easy for me, or easier. It's not easy. Thank you. There was a compliment that my writing is accessible, and I hope
it is.
Thank
Sorry
you.
For me to
Thank you.
Off. I just wanted to say, everything you've said is so lovely.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. It was really nice to Zoom, to scroll through and see everyone, and see everyone in their homes. And I'm just so glad that we can still have this conversation. And
I know. I wish
Yeah.
it would be in a different venue. Unfortunately, the world has gone. I'll just say 2020. I don't know what
But
else to say.
in the 1000th month of the 57th, day. Yes. But it was lovely to have you all in my home, in my office.
I love
Brooklyn.
your office. I don't know about anybody
Thank you.
else. And I hope you and your daughter get to read a lot together, and maybe you will. History, children's books. I don't know. I'm a reference librarian, so that's not my expertise.
She can refer you to plenty of books.
But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It was just such a delight. And I really appreciate, because I'm biased, how much you love libraries and librarians, because we really do the best we can every day. I know that sounds really corny, but it's true.
It really is. And I couldn't do what I do without librarians. And so many people have gotten their entire education at libraries run by women. So thank you so much for your work. And thank you to everyone in Ohio for coming to your computer tonight or your phone. It was really nice for me. And I hope that everyone has a expedient end of year. Remember that at the end of 1776, Washington and the financier of the Revolution, Robert Morris, were writing each other letters very similar to what we just said. It's the longest year ever. Thank God this is over. It will never happen again. So it really hasn't. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much. It was really nice.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
You too.